You probably already know this, but how a TV show ends is generally the most important part. And while the finale doesn't always reflect how good the show is, even scientifically, it's just a fact that we're more likely to remember the start and the end as compared to the middle. Like, I bet a lot of people could tell me about the emotional scene that starts the movie up, but I think that if I asked the same group of people to tell me the name of the bird, who was an actual character, not as many people would be able to answer. It's Kevin, by the way. And finding this out, it probably seems like a bad thing, but if you think about it, it could be the reason that finales are so impactful. With that being said though, there's obviously more to it, which begs the question of what exactly it is that can make a finale so good. And to try and answer this question, I'm going to be talking about 5 shows that I believe have perfect endings. First, we have Gravity Falls. It's one of my favorite shows, and while there's definitely a lot to talk about when it comes to the show as a whole, because the entire story builds up to one point, I think that in the discussion of the best moments in the show, what I see brought up the most is the ending. The purpose of the ending was to tie up all of the running storylines, as well as to provide the conclusion, and somehow the writers managed to do all of this, as well as more. The reason the finale is talked about more than all the other parts of the show is that it's honestly hard to talk about the rest of the show without mentioning the finale. What I mean by this is that almost every aspect of the show eventually leads into something in the finale, and it's really just because the show is structured for everything to come together in the very end. Throughout the show, we see 2 storylines that follow both sets of twins, and while they are metaphorically connected, they're also literally connected by Bill, who makes deals with them and represents the devil. Both storylines revolve around choosing family over Bill's temptations, and the way this ideology weaves its way into the final episodes really connects both storylines, because at the forefront of the story, we only see the grand spectacles of the conclusion, which focus on how powerful Bill Cipher is, and how he really seems like an unstoppable force. But obviously, because he's eventually defeated, we could look back at the story as a whole and realize that throughout the 2 seasons of the show, Bill Cipher was never really in control, and that the only times that he did have strength, that his strength came from human greed. And I know it sounds like I'm starting to stretch this, but if we look back into the series, we begin to see a pattern where Bill takes advantage of various people and helps them reach their shallow goals by making deals with them, and in turn, he gains more power. First, he takes advantage of Ford, showing him technology and tricking him into building the portal. Then he offers Gideon a way to steal the deed to the Mystery Shack, and the third time he convinces Dipper to let him possess his body, which once again plays into our desires and furthers his plan. So now we can see that throughout the show, there's a common theme of Bill playing off of greed, which is represented in the finale when everything lines up, and with a final deal, he tricks Mabel into letting him enter. And throughout these 4 examples, which are all connected in some way, it's shown that Bill's power doesn't come from his abilities, but through the weakness of the human mind and the greed that we succumb to. The reason this is important to the finale is that Bill is a being who cannot be overcome through selfish tricks, because he is the best at that. The message shown throughout the show keeps telling us that the only way he could be defeated is through an act that goes against everything he stands for, and I think you all know where I'm going with this. In one of the final scenes, Stanley, the character who has been shown to be a trickster and con artist, turns out to be the one who defeats Bill, and while it is through a trick, it's not through a selfish one. The final scene where Stan defeats him doesn't just stand out because of the way of his sacrifice, but because the reason that Bill lost ultimately came down to the fact that Bill doesn't believe that humans can act selflessly, and so he ends up losing to self-sacrifice. The reason he lost isn't because he isn't smart, but because the plan that defeats him is something that Bill doesn't account for. The impact of the scene doesn't just come from Stan's sacrifice, but from everything that stood for and every moment leading up to it. Throughout the show, we've seen Bill win every interaction by offering something to them, but in the end he loses because that's the only place his power comes from, and when the characters learn to overcome their greed, they ultimately were the winners. The feeling we experience is because of how in that moment when everything comes to a close, we really begin to see how everything was leading to that moment, and that even though it's all we're left with, it recontextualizes everything before it. What I got from this finale is that the end of the show should represent the growth that the characters experienced, and when that growth is what lets the characters overcome the villain, it's something that really just feels right and is present in a lot of the best finales. Something that I think is very similar to this in a completely opposite way is the ending to BoJack Horseman. You see, much like Gravity Falls, the ending to BoJack Horseman summarizes the lessons that are present throughout the show, while also giving us a proper goodbye to all the characters. But unlike Gravity Falls, BoJack is a character who doesn't grow, and the message of the show is more about the consequences to our actions rather than the importance of family. This message is incredibly present throughout the second to last episode, and while there are a lot of things that make this episode really good, such as the sense of dread and the symbolism, this is not what I'm going to be talking about. For those of you who don't know, the second to last episode of BoJack Horseman takes place in BoJack's mind while he drowns to death in a pool, and while this happens, BoJack is able to talk with everyone he has lost. But something that is really important about this is eventually BoJack acknowledges that he isn't actually talking to them, and that's really just his brain trying to come to terms with what's happened and how he will be remembered for everything he has done. The episode contains a lot of symbolism, and as it unfolds, it really just sets in that BoJack might actually die here. The reason this is important is that throughout the show, BoJack is a character who does a lot of bad things, and even though we want him to change and he tries to change, he never really changes. Throughout the show, we see his actions begin to catch up with him, and as it goes on, he slowly runs out of avenues that he could go down, which ultimately culminates in this episode. And something that sets this episode apart from the others is how different this is from the rest of the show. And what I mean by this is that while Gravity Falls is the logical progression of the character arcs and storylines, the conclusion to BoJack is more like a sudden realization that fully contextualizes the events of the series in a different way than we're used to. We always knew that BoJack wasn't the best person, but when BoJack himself began to realize this, he could always push it away. But in the finale, he believes that he's going to die, and because of this, we finally get to see the side of him that he was always pushing away. Because BoJack as a character would never admit to his flaws, unless, like in the current situation, he has nothing left to lose, the episode shows us something that was always there, but never able to be explored. The reason I like this finale so much is that it takes everything that has been established already and really just puts it all together and finally reveals what sits at the very bottom of it all. And the way it does this is dark and mysterious and comes together perfectly in a way that really just felt like it was something that was a long time coming. When the episode ends, we don't really get a happy ending, and we don't really get closure, but just like BoJack, we get to sit with the ultimate outcome that his actions led him to, which is the direction that the entire show has been leaning towards. The episode confronts a fear that we all have, and makes us sit with an idea that we often avoid and push away, just as BoJack does. It's something that manages to unlock a really specific emotion that can really only come from the end of something that you care about. The reason I specify that something that can only happen at the end of the story is that a lot of the emotion comes from the context, and without knowing what leads up to it, the episode just won't be as important. And while a finale can be good as a standalone episode, what I think is more important is the appeal to the actual fans of the show. Like for example, the season 10 finale of Futurama was an episode that focused on the relationship between two of the main characters, which is something that had been on and off throughout the show's run, but doesn't become official until the series ends. And obviously, if this is the only episode you saw, it wouldn't really mean anything to you, but the beauty of this type of finale is that unlike most episodes of a show, it's not made for the general audience, because when a show ends, it no longer has to pander to the network and can really be written just for the fans and the creators rather than the ratings. And that when ending the show, the writers have nearly endless ways to do it, and that despite how many ways the show can end, they choose to do it the way they did. When we get such a character-based finale that follows the relationship of two characters from such a long-running show, we begin to get the sense that the finale to Futurama was only made for the long-running fans, and because of this, the writers could go all in on an idea that they couldn't otherwise. And the way this is reflected in the two shows that I've talked about already is how you can't have Bill Cipher appear too much in the beginning of the show, just because it would lessen his appeal as a character. In the same way in BoJack, you can't really have him reflect on himself unless he is about to die, which you can only really do once. Just like these two shows, the end of Futurama is something that was built up to for a while, but finally experiencing what everything was leading up to is something that you really have to go through to actually understand. When it really comes down to it, the emotion doesn't really come from the episode itself, but more the way that the episode represents the show as a whole. Representing the show as a whole is something that is really hard to do, but when the writers have certain freedoms that they normally wouldn't, we get finales like that of Adventure Time. Adventure Time is a show that I have talked about a lot on this channel, but somehow I haven't talked about the finale. It's a show that thrives derives from its amazing characters, and when the finale first aired, I was really expecting something that embodied this idea, but when it was airing, it really wasn't as good as I was hoping, and even though it did a perfect job ending the story for Betty, and kind of closing off the stories for everyone else, it definitely felt rushed. And I know that the show was being rushed to a close by Cartoon Network, but when the finale aired, we really didn't get that much for most of the main characters, that is, until we got the true finale to the show on HBO Max. The true finale to the show is an episode called Together Again, and similar to how Futurama follows the relationship between Fry and Leela, Together Again follows Finn reuniting in the afterlife with Jake, and with no doubt in my mind is an episode that is written for the fans. It centers around the two main characters and really lets them be who they were meant to be in the show without limiting them in any way whatsoever. The central theme of the episode is Finn and Jake's relationship, and more importantly, the episode itself really feels like an episode of Adventure Time in the way it's written and how it's structured, and even just the villain. And overall, it's just one of the most fitting conclusions that the show could have had. The episode continues the character dynamic that the show left behind, and despite taking place in the future, it really feels like it's still an episode of Adventure Time in the sense that it doesn't feel too different from the main series, the way that some of the other finales do, and it kind of feels like an homage to the series as a whole. It's way more emotional than most episodes, and because of how much it represents, the emotional moments just hit so hard in a way that only makes sense to people who have really watched the show and connect deeply to the characters. With shows like this, there's just a certain beauty to the finality of it all, because when shows like this run for so long then finally come to an end, we really begin to see them in a new light, and even though we're sad that it's over, we can still be happy that it happened at all. What all of the shows I've talked about already have in common is that they are completely unique to their own story and are free to do things that they couldn't otherwise. When a show is ending, we're given a lot more paths to explore, and even though it feels like there's a lot that can still happen, by the time it's over, we realize that what we're going to see is only a fraction of what was possible, which is kind of sad, but also beautiful at the same time. When I started this video, I said that I would explain what separates a good finale from a perfect one, and by the time I reached the end of my script, I think that the answer to this question is that a perfect finale should be a true embodiment of a show and represent what the show stands for, and while good writing helps, I think that what makes a finale perfect isn't its writing or story, but how the end can take every aspect of a show and combine it into one episode that tells the full story of the show through its conclusion. The finale that I think really gets this right is the ending to Regular Show. Two things that defined Regular Show were how the episodes started fairly normal and quickly escalated, and how real the emotional moments were when they appeared. And the reason that I bring this up is that the finale of Regular Show takes these two ideas and runs with them as far as they can, which is incredibly fitting to the way the show normally is. And when the show ends with the highest stakes it's ever had, and one of the most emotional sequences in the show's entire run, it's impossible to think of it being any other way. The finale to Regular Show is something that I really want to talk about for a while, but the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that my words will never do it justice. It's something that you really have to experience to understand, and I think that alone really leads us to the answer of the question that we started with. I think that what really separates perfect finales is simply how they understand their audience, and the one thing that they all have in common is that they all knew exactly what to do to make the audience feel something. Anyways, that's all for now, so I'll see you in the next one.